So last week, in the last 5 minutes of our class, we discussed the introduction to Ecclesiastes. We went over the fact that Ecclesiastes is the 21st book in the Old Testament and the 4th in the section of wisdom or inspired poetry. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon would be in those 5 books that are right here. Before we get into the major prophets and the minor prophets. And for some, does this book go to Daniel or Ezekiel? I forget.
Ezekiel.
Yeah, for some reason, I guess Daniel is a pretty large book too. He sort of left out one book from the major prophets for book 2. But there's a lot of material in this book nonetheless. And so what we're going to deal with to start with is the origin of Ecclesiastes. And as we always do, we're going to start with the title. And the Hebrew designates the title, I'll get this wrong, Dabar Koheleth, which means words of the preacher. That'll be a sermon title sometime. I like that. The words of the preacher. And it wouldn't be the one speaking necessarily. It's the words of the preacher from the Bible. Where do we get that from? Well, we get it from the first verse in Ecclesiastes. So we'll start with Naomi, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1.
The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem.
So, again, this would be where the title comes from. Koheleth refers to one who addresses an assembly. That's really what the term means. And if you're addressing an assembly of religious people, we call that person the preacher. Usually. The ones who speak from the Word of God. In the Greek Septuagint, they gave the title Ecclesiastes. And it would almost be spelled the same way as we have it. Only difference is the 2 C's are replaced with 2 K's. And there are 2 S's in Ecclesia. And this one, the Greek term refers to one who calls or exhorts an assembly. That's what Ecclesiastes means there. I'm not saying that if you don't recognize this word that's in there that somehow you've missed something. But is there a word in the title, in the English title, that is familiar to anyone? And it's a Greek word. It wouldn't be an English word. It's called out, but it would be the Greek form of that, which is ecclesia. Ecclesia is found in the book, in the title, Ecclesiastes. And ecclesia is a Greek word for a group of called out people, or the church. That's the Greek word we find for church. And so when we talk about ecclesia in the New Testament, we'd be talking about a group of people, an assembly, which would be referred to as the church. So when the church assembles together, when we discuss the difference between a denominational church and the way people think of church today as an organization, and we come along and say, no, church isn't an organization, it's a group of people. It's the people. And so when an assembly gathers to worship on Sunday morning, like we're going to gather at 11 o'clock, the church assembles. Now, if Christians decide to assemble for Bible study, whether it's in the building that the church owns or not, it's not the church assembled. This is not the church assembled right now. And the reason why I know that is because some of the members of the church aren't in this room. They're upstairs. They're upstairs in class. The church assembled would be a set time when the church decides to assemble as one group. And so that's a distinction that sometimes people miss when discussing the difference between Bible study and worship and what's the difference, because sometimes we'll sing during Bible study. We will pray, and we did this morning. And what's really the difference? The difference is the group assembled. And the church assembles at certain times. The church assembles sometimes to withdraw from someone. 1 Corinthians 5 says, when the church gathers together in one place, the church will assemble to eat the Lord's Supper. Church assembles. Sometimes the church will assemble to discuss a matter, as they did in, Jeff and I were discussing in Acts 15 earlier, but we'll leave that for another time. The church, though, is the word ecclesia, found in the book of Ecclesiastes. Is there anything else in the title before we move on? Usually it's pretty self-explanatory and we get into the Greek, which probably bores a lot of people. And the second section is the author. Who's the author of Ecclesiastes, or at least who seems to be the author of Ecclesiastes? Solomon. So the question that's asked is, how do the following passages of Ecclesiastes provide evidence that point to King Solomon as the author? We've already read Ecclesiastes 1 verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, you might say, well, that's Solomon. Well, remember, David had many sons. And Absalom was his son, even though he is dead. Adonijah would try to take the throne before Solomon. Solomon was anointed, but Adonijah tried to usurp that. Doesn't necessarily mean in this verse that that's Solomon, because there are sons of David. And for that matter, Jesus was a son of David. He wasn't a direct son of David. So we need other verses to sort of give us hints. Before we get them, Gord, you have a comment?
Oh, well, I was just looking at 12 and 13.
Yeah, and we're going to get 12. Why don't you get verse 12 and 13 for us? Because that's the first set
The
of verses.
preacher was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. That this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. So it's talking about one being a king and one about wisdom. So we need both of them.
Those are two very big keys. And when we add up all the 5 verses, we're going to get a pretty good picture. But just because he was king over Jerusalem and just because he sought out wisdom doesn't necessarily mean he's Solomon. It could have been, say, Asa, could have been Hezekiah, because remember from Proverbs, the Hezekiah's scribes wrote out some of the Proverbs of Solomon. I'm not saying I'm agreeing with that. I'm just saying possibilities. Let's get verse 16 of Ecclesiastes 1. Kala.
I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were up over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed the work of wisdom and knowledge. Sorry, I don't know what.
It's all right. This should give us a big hint. It talks about the wisest man ever to rule over Jerusalem, or to live in Jerusalem. Remember what God had told Solomon when he provided him wisdom? There will be none before you and none after you that would have the wisdom that I'm going to provide you. This is a big clue. But let's get some other clues. Lisa, you want to get Ecclesiastes 2, verse 3.
I said in my heart, how to rectify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives.
So what is this verse telling us about the writer of this book? What does verse 3 tell us? I sought to my heart to give myself wine, but found out it was folly. He had unequaled opportunity to seek out the pleasures of the flesh, or carnal pleasures. Should tell us about Solomon. Solomon, we remember, in the end, that's what he did. That's the type of life he had. He had so many wives, so many concubines. We'll get to his wealth in a second. But he was the king. He had desired these things. He found that they were folly because of how he wasted parts of his life. But, again, points to Solomon. Henry, do you want to get verses 4 to 7 of Ecclesiastes 2?
I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the field. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had great possessions of the herds and the flocks, and all the work in Jerusalem before me.
This should remind us of Solomon. Solomon built many things. He built many things. He not only is known for building the temple, but he built palaces for himself. He built, he was one of the great builders in Israel, according to the book of 1 Kings. And so this should remind us of Solomon, all the great works he did, all the vineyards he planted, and it was just grandeur, physical grandeur. That should remind us of Solomon more than any of the other kings of Israel. And the last one, we'll get, Cherry, do you want to get verse 8 of Ecclesiastes 2? So what's this verse tell us about the writer here?
He was in a position to get money from the people.
Yeah.
So,
And if he was in that position, what does that tell us about his wealth? He was going to be pretty wealthy. And Solomon was very wealthy. He was one of the richest kings. Remember, he ruled over Israel when it was at its zenith, when its land was really where God had said it would be, from the Euphrates all the way down to the river of Egypt. He was the only king to rule over that expansive land. David had a large kingdom, but Solomon expanded it, and Rehoboam divided it. It was never that big again, and that's why history doesn't find that much of Solomon's kingdom, because it wasn't that long. Solomon reigned for 40 years, and that was really, and he didn't have it for his entire kingdom. And so Solomon's kingdom was the largest of any king before Israel and after, because Israel would split apart. Then you'd have these other countries, they'd split off too. Syria, we'd find, Assyria, we'd find later, and Israel never had that control after Solomon. But he was one of the wealthiest kings. He had gold and silver. He had ships, like as far as he had armies. He was very wealthy. So all of these point to Solomon being the author of this, as well as the author of Proverbs and the next books, the Song of Solomon. So those are all passages. We can be fairly comfortable in asserting that Solomon is the author of this book, just by what is said in this book. Which brings us on to the date. Assuming that Solomon is the author of this book, we're going to get our timeline all the way back to Sinai. We're going to get up to Jesus and the cross, but Solomon would be right here, about 971 BC. And he would reign for, as I said, 40 years. And so somewhere in there is Solomon writing Ecclesiastes. And according to tradition, the Song of Solomon was written early in Solomon's reign. The Song of Solomon seems like a young man's poem, book. It's manifesting a young man's love. So the Song of Solomon would be written early. Then we had Proverbs written in the mature years, expressing a middle-aged man's wisdom. And Ecclesiastes was written in his later years, revealing an old man's regret. We're up to Tim. You want to get Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1. Oh, I'm sorry. You want me to come back to you, Tim? I'll move up to Jeff, and then I'll come back to you in a second. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1.
Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them.
This is not a young man speaking here. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. We know that verse. That verse is an often quoted verse. Many sermons are preached from that verse. That's not a young man saying that, though. It's an old man giving an exhortation to the youth. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, while the evil days don't come and your years draw nigh. In other words, you get so old that you are close to death. And when you look back on your life, when you didn't remember your Creator and don't have any pleasure in what you did, you thought your life was vain, wasted, because you did not seek after God. So this is an old man speaking here. And so the tradition would most likely have Ecclesiastes written closer to 931 than it is 971. But that's just some thoughts. Any other thoughts? Bill?
I just thought, other than Christ and God's purpose for him, but when you think about it, timeline made me just think, 1,500 years, what God had intended for Israel, they enjoyed for 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
After 1,500 years of everything he'd done, and then Israel was in her zenith 40 years, and then poof.
Why was that?
Well, sin.
Sin. That's exactly true.
It's something for us.
It's
made me reflect on our lives.
Yeah, and as our lives being short, the kingdom of Israel was fairly short as far as at its zenith. It survived for a long time, but not at its zenith. Remember, when Saul became king, Israel was a kingdom, but it was sort of like a collection of provinces. You had the different tribes, and they all had their different think-sos. Like it's like when we think of Canada. This is one country with 10 provinces. Ontario has its own ideas. British Columbia has some different ideas, and so does Alberta. And then there's Quebec. And we're one country, but 10 different provinces. Well, Israel was one country, but with 12 different tribes. And they were ruled by judges up until Saul. Saul consolidated a lot of what is Israel, but it was still a collection. But you think about it. After David and Solomon, we read of Israel and Judah. Ephraim is going to be the major tribe of Israel. And of course, Judah is the major tribe of Judah. What happened to Simeon and Reuben and Issachar? And we don't read of those tribes anymore. It's consolidated in a kingdom. And Solomon ruled the most expansive kingdom that Israel ever had. Saul started it, David continued it, Solomon completed it, and Rehoboam ruined it. And so that's really your look at Israel. It took 120 years. Saul reigned for 40, David reigned for 40, Solomon reigned for 40. 120 years to get it all the way there, and it took a very short time to ruin it. And that's true with our lives. Think about it. We can work for a long time to build a reputation, to build knowledge and wisdom in the scriptures, but it doesn't seem to take all that much time to have it all go away just like that. Through one thing that was foolish, or for one moment that we shouldn't have had, put situation we shouldn't have put ourselves in, reputations can go away just like that. And it's an exhortation that life is short. James says our life is like a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. We think, well, 80 years, that's a long time. 80 years is a short time. It's only long for us because we haven't lived that long. And for someone who's 10, 80 years is a long time. Well, think about it. It's only 8 more times that you can be 10. And that really does bring it down to something short. 365 days in a year. So every 10 years is 3,650 days, give or take, the leap years. Well, multiply that by 8 and you're still only at about 28,000 days. And that seems like a lot, but how quickly our days go. And we spend 8 hours every day sleeping. Well, some of us spend 6 hours. But between 6 and 8 hours every day sleeping. So take a third of that away. And then it really starts getting to be a small number. Something to consider. Jeff?
As far as the overview of the book itself, it's probably one of the fewer books that are kind of simple in its construction, the way it's written. I mean, we already read that verse in chapter 1, verse 13, where Solomon says, "And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven." And ends and concludes the book with, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter." And pretty much everything follows a straight line to that conclusion. So it's nice in that way, understanding and overview of this book. It's very simple.
Yeah, it is, and you're not jumping in, like as far as 1st and 2nd Kings, you're jumping between this king and that king, and this king's reigning, well that king's reigning, and you're going, whoa, when are we talking about, what years, and I'm confused. If we delve into timelines, we can easily be confused. Focus on what's being talked about, it's not so confusing, but Ecclesiastes seems to be a straight line. And in that sense, it is a very easy book to follow when going through the entire thing. So that brings us out of the origin to the purpose of Ecclesiastes. And I'm glad I had this page today. I almost didn't print it. I'm like, oh, well, we usually spend a lot of time on date, author, and other things, and we only spent 25 minutes on it. So let's start with the historical purpose of Ecclesiastes. And really the historical purpose is to demonstrate that earthly life and man has not really changed throughout all time. You ever heard the phrase, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it? History seems to repeat itself. Wars, we have wars today. Well, we had wars 50 years ago, and we had wars 150 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. That doesn't change. We have religious error today. Well, we had religious error 50 years ago, and 150 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. Men and women are born. Some become great people. Some don't. And then we die. It's, as the Lion King says, the circle of life. And it really is a circle. Things repeat itself a lot. Earthly life really hasn't changed. We have technology today that we didn't have 50 years ago. Yes, that has changed, but in reality, it hasn't. It's just a newer way of getting the news. A faster way of doing the same tasks that we've always done. And in fact, sometimes it's to become lazier because you don't have to do those tasks. They don't take as long. And so let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We've read some of it, but we'll get more of it. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to read verses 2 to 11. We'll start with Tim, and we'll move to Sandy, and then up and around one verse each through verse 11. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 2 to 11.
Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity out of vanity, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun?
One generation passes away, another generation comes, but the earth abounds forever. The sun also burns, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the great wind blows.
Wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again.
Verse 8, going of chapter 1.
If you do not know the fairest among women.
No. Ecclesiastes 1. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 8 and 9.
All things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be, and that which is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun.
Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after.
So, Tim had a verse that had vanity in there 5 times. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanities. Vanities, uselessness, vain. And so it's uselessness of uselessness, says the preacher, as far as what he's about to talk about. What profit has a man in all his labor which he takes under the sun? What is he saying in that verse? Is there nothing to profit about what we do?
Well, in the end, it's useless. There's no benefit to it in the end.
Why? You're right, but why? What happens to us?
Well, we will die. Somebody will just inherit or will be passed on. It's like, as he said, grasping for the wind. It's just useless.
We'll die, and eventually, most of us will be forgotten. There's a few people we remember about from history. We remember, we remember reading about Sir John A. Macdonald, first Prime Minister of Canada. Here, American, George Washington. We remember about some of the closer people in history, but go back 1,000 years. Well, I remember Prince John of England. He's famous for the Magna Carta, and if you read the stories of Robin Hood. But I don't remember any of the English kings back then. You'd really have to dig. Like, as far as you have to really be a historian to remember them. Go back even before that. There's not many people in history we know about. Muhammad would have been in the first millennia AD, the prophet of the Muslims. But there's not much that we can remember unless we really dig into history. And anyone who is not famous is not remembered. And that's why it's vanity in this case. It doesn't mean that work is useless to us. It's just useless on the whole, because we're going to leave it all behind when we die. And it's not going to be remembered. And the people who come afterwards who think that they've created something new really haven't, because it's been done of old. There's a couple other things I want to get in here that are just interesting when you talk about even creation, and about how Solomon knew this, because it had to have been revealed to by God. Okay, we understand the sun sets and the sun rises. And we understand that part happens every day. But notice what verse 6 says. The wind goes towards the south, turns about towards the north. It whirls around continually and returns again according to its circuits. That's weather. We have, generally our weather comes from the west. What happens in Chicago yesterday, a lot of the time affects us today, or a couple days later. And hurricanes, we know, they follow a track. Starting on the west coast of Africa, they follow the Atlantic Ocean, and they sometimes will wind up, depending on where the heat of the ocean is. Sometimes they'll turn down to South America, sometimes they'll hit the islands in Jamaica, and then hit the southern United States. But they return. They follow a path. We look at the weather maps, we can see there are paths of wind. They didn't have the weather maps then. They could sort of understand, okay, my weather comes from the north, but they wouldn't have known about basically the channels of the circuits of the jet streams and the different wind cycles. Again, rivers run into the sea, and yet the sea is not full. We think about it. Rain comes from the clouds, and you would think eventually, with all the rain we get, that the oceans would fill up and flood the earth. Well, that doesn't happen. And we know now why. Water evaporates into the clouds, and that's why we get rain. And so that's why the earth doesn't flood. The water cycle in this chapter. God revealed it to Solomon. He said it, and it's here, long before man ever knew it or could prove it. And then he gets to down here saying there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new. And there's our phrase, under the sun, again, from man's perspective. It's nothing new. It's all been done before, just maybe in a different way. Did you have something, Jeff? Or I thought you were sort of questioning. So the question that Dave asks is, why is it important to recognize that man in earthly life has not substantially changed throughout the history of this world? Why is it important that we understand that? Bill?
I kind of look at that as generally man down through history has lived his life and done what he wants to do, and he's done it without God.
Mm-hmm.
It's always the same. Like you're saying, history repeats itself. And, I just read where they said that the Second World War is also known as the war that was to end all wars. War hasn't ended. And man, you know what I mean? And why it hasn't ended is because of man's will and his greed. But if we had God in there.
Yeah, that would be true. God has not promised that wars would end, but you think about it, if we follow God, we wouldn't go to war. Really, because what's God say? Love your neighbor. Do better to your neighbor than you do to yourself. You don't really, if you're following God truly, that's what you would do. The World War, your comment on World War II is really apt. We're still fighting World War II. Really, take a look at the wars today, and they're an extension of what happened at the end of World War II. World War II was what happened in World War I, and all of these wars, they can go back to other wars that we've had. Why did they fight the Vietnam War? Well, because of the Russians. At the end, they were trying to stop communism from expanding, but that all happened at the end of the Second World War. Germany and Berlin and everything. Today, is the reason the Middle East is a mess? The end of World War II. The state of Israel didn't exist as a state of Israel until after the end of World War II. The Middle East is a mess because of that. I'm not taking a side on anything regards to that, but that's history. That's something that cannot be disputed. Calla.
You hear people saying all the time too, this is why we have earthquakes, famines, this, that, because Jesus is coming. Like they say, they're using that, but we have always, and I'm trying, always still in Charlotte work, we always had earthquakes, famine, disasters, all these things, but no, it's written in Matthew that this is it, this is it. You guys don't, I don't know about you guys, and there it goes into a whole lot more. So
Yeah.
they're using
Not-
that to say.
Nothing new under the sun, though.
This is
Earthquakes.
new.
Yeah. Nothing new. Where I got from this is we need to emphasize that any view of life that does not arise above the earth, in other words, turn to God, as Bill was saying, is empty and worthless. I'm going to get Ecclesiastes chapter 3, just for time's sake, because the bell's about to go. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 9 through 15. What profit has he that worketh in that wherein he labors? I have seen the travail which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also he has set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, it is the gift of God. Know that whatsoever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God does it, that men should fear before him. That which that which has been is now, and that which is to be hath already been. And God requires that which is past. Think about how many times we read about God in that just that little section, verses 9 through 15. A man who does not really look to God is not going to be the one that really rejoices in a lot. The stuff we rejoice in goes away. It's fleeting. We always have our ups and downs, but for a Christian, the downs won't be as far down, because remember, we're to trust in God. We still have God. We may have lost everything we possess in this earth, but we haven't lost anything when it comes to salvation if we continue following what God says. And so we rejoice in what God has given us. Some people are not content with what they have. They're always going after more. They always need that extra dollar, that extra $10, $100. Christians rejoice in what God has given them. They are content with what God has given them. And so that's really where I go with the question. It goes along with what Bill was saying and what Calla was saying, that we do need God in our lives. If we don't have God in our lives, really, our life is worthless.